The crystal vase shattered against the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the silent mansion like a gunshot. Abigail Kelechi froze, her dark eyes wide with horror as she stared at the glittering shards scattered across the pristine white tiles. The expensive Korean porcelain, worth more than 6 months of her salary, lay in ruins at her feet. Her heart hammered against her ribcage as heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. "What have you done?" The voice was ice, pure, crystallized fury. Park Min-ho stood in the doorway of his study, his tall frame rigid with barely contained rage. At 45, he was devastatingly handsome in that sharp, dangerous way, all harsh angles and cold eyes that could freeze blood. His tailored black suit hung perfectly on his broad shoulders, every inch of him radiating the kind of power that came from controlling boardrooms and breaking competitors. But Abigail saw something else in those dark eyes. Something buried, so deep that perhaps he'd forgotten it was there. Pain. "Sir, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her Nigerian accent thick with panic. "I was just dusting and the cloth caught." "Get out!" The words were quiet, deadly. "Please, Mr. Park, I can clean." "I said get out." His voice cracked like a whip, and Abigail flinched. "You've been here for 3 days and you've done nothing but disrupt this house with your singing, your constant noise, your incompetence." Abigail's hands trembled as she bent to gather the broken pieces. "I'll pay for it. I'll work extra hours, I promise." "Don't touch it." Minho's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "That vase was my wife's favorite. She bought it on our honeymoon in Busan 15 years ago." "Oh God. Oh no." Abigail straightened slowly, meeting his eyes. She saw it then, the way his jaw clenched, the minute tremble in his clenched fists. This wasn't about a vase. This was about a woman who would never touch it again. "I'm sorry," she said softly, genuinely. "I didn't know. But Mr. Park." She took a breath, channeling every ounce of courage her mother had raised her with. "Breaking beautiful things and keeping them broken, it doesn't honor the people we've lost. It just keeps us trapped with the ghosts." The silence that followed was suffocating. Minho stared at this woman, this stranger who had invaded his carefully constructed tomb of a home with her bright African prince and her impossibly warm smile and her god's-forsaken humming while she worked. Who was she to speak about loss? About grief? "You're fired," he said coldly. "Pack your things. I'll have my driver take you back to the agency." He turned to leave, dismissing her with the same casual cruelty he perfected over the past 18 months since Sujin's death. "No." Minho stopped, turned slowly. "Excuse me." Abigail lifted her chin, her full lips pressed into a determined line. Even in her simple maid's uniform, she somehow commanded the space with a quiet dignity that unsettled him. "No, Mr. Park. I won't leave. You have no choice. You're dismissed. Your daughter needs me." The air in the room changed instantly. Minho's eyes flashed dangerously as he took a step toward her. "You will not presume to tell me what my daughter needs." "Then who will?" Abigail challenged, her voice rising with passion. "Because that child is dying inside this house of silence. She hasn't spoken in 6 months. 6 months. The agency told me everything. She sits in her room, doesn't eat, doesn't sleep properly. And you," she pointed at him, propriety abandoned. "You hide in your study and your office and pretend that if you don't acknowledge the pain, it will just disappear." Minho closed the distance between them in 3 strides. He towered over her, his face inches from hers, and Abigail suddenly became acutely aware of several things at once: the expensive cologne that clung to him, cedar and something darker, the heat radiating from his body, the way his chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, the dangerous glint in his eyes that sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. "You know nothing about my family," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Nothing about what we've endured. You're a maid, an employee, and you've been here for 72 hours. So tell me, Miss Kelechi, what possible delusion makes you think you have any right to speak to me this way?" Abigail's pulse raced, but she held her ground, tilting her head back to maintain eye contact. "The delusion that I'm the first person in over a year who's been honest with you instead of afraid of you." Their eyes locked. The tension was electric, crackling in the small space between them. Minho could see the rapid flutter of her pulse in her throat, could smell the sweet scent of coconut oil in her hair. Something hot and unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Anger, yes, but something else. Something he thought died with his wife. He stepped back abruptly as if burned. 1 week, he said tersely. You have 1 week to prove yourself useful. If Jiwoo shows no improvement, you leave. And Miss Kelechi, his eyes raked over her with cold precision. Stay out of my way. He turned and strode from the room, leaving Abigail trembling, though whether from fear, anger, or something far more complicated she couldn't say. From the top of the stairs, 16-year-old Park Jiwoo watched the entire exchange through the banister rails, her dark eyes wide with something that looked almost like hope. 3 days later, the smell of cooking spices filled the Park mansion for the first time in 18 months. Minho stood in the doorway of his kitchen, briefcase in hand, staring at a scene that seemed to belong in someone else's life. Abigail moved around his state-of-the-art kitchen with confident efficiency, humming a melody he didn't recognize while stirring something in a large pot. She tied a colorful Nigerian head wrap around her natural hair, and the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows seemed to make her brown skin glow. But that wasn't what made him stop. It was Jiwoo. His daughter sat at the kitchen island, a small smile playing at her lips as she watched Abigail cook. She wasn't speaking, still hadn't said a word, but her eyes followed the maid's movements with something resembling curiosity. Interest. Life. And then my brother, Chitty, he thought he could impress the girls at church by climbing the tallest palm tree in our village, Abigail was saying, her voice animated and warm. But what he didn't know was that tree was home to the angriest monkey in all of Lagos. That monkey chased him all the way to the river. She made exaggerated running motions with her arms, and Jiwoo's smile widened slightly. And Chitty, he jumped in with all his church clothes on. Pastor was not happy. Not happy at all. Minho watched, transfixed, as his daughter's shoulders shook with what might have been silent laughter. When was the last time he'd seen her smile? Mr. Park. Abigail noticed him, her expression shifting to something more guarded. You're home early. I'm making jollof rice for dinner. I thought Jiwoo might like to try something different. I don't recall authorizing you to use my kitchen for ethnic experiments, he said coolly, defaulting to the ice that had become his armor. He saw Abigail's jaw tighten, saw the flash of hurt in her eyes before she masked it with professional politeness. Of course, sir. I'll clean everything and prepare a traditional Korean meal. Jiwoo's hand shot out, gripping Abigail's wrist. Everyone froze. The girl looked at her father with pleading eyes, shaking her head slowly. Don't make her stop. Please don't make her stop. Minho felt something crack in his chest. His daughter hadn't initiated physical contact with anyone since her mother's funeral, hadn't shown preference or desire for anything. And now she was holding on to the stranger as if letting go meant drowning. Fine, he heard himself say. I'll try some. After I change. He turned and walked away before either of them could see his face, before they could witness the way his carefully constructed walls trembled. 20 minutes later, he returned in casual clothes, black slacks and a simple gray sweater, to find the table set for 3. Abigail had lit candles. Candles! In his dining room that had sat dark and unused for over a year. This is inappropriate, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Eating dinner with your daughter is inappropriate. Abigail raised an eyebrow, a challenge in her warm brown eyes. In Nigeria, we say that a family that doesn't eat together is just people living in the same house. This isn't Nigeria. No, she agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. But sadness is the same in every language, Mr. Park. And so is healing. Something about the way she said it, without pity, without judgment, just gentle truth, made his throat tight. They ate in relative silence, but it was different from the oppressive quiet that usually filled the house. Abigail told stories between bites, painting vivid pictures of her childhood in Lagos, her large family, the music and chaos and life that seemed to follow her everywhere. Jiwoo listened intently, occasionally nodding or shaking her head in response to Abigail's questions. And Minho found himself watching Abigail's face as she spoke. The way her eyes sparkled when she laughed at her own stories, the graceful movement of her hands as she gestured, the generous curve of her mouth. He looked away quickly when she caught him staring. This is excellent, he admitted grudgingly, gesturing to the jollof rice. The spices are complex. Abigail's smile could have lit the entire room. High praise from the Ice King. Excuse me. Oh. Her hand flew to her mouth. I didn't mean to say that out loud. The staff at the agency, they never mind. They call me the Ice King. Despite himself, Minho felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Among other things, Abigail muttered, then seemed to realize what she'd said. I mean, you're very respected, sir. Very professional. Cold, he supplied. Mean. Heartless. She met his eyes, and for a moment, the air between them charged with that same electric tension from their first confrontation. Not heartless, she said softly. Just someone who loved so deeply that losing it froze everything else. The words hit him like a physical blow. Minho stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I have work to do. Thank you for dinner. He retreated to his study, closing the door firmly behind him. But instead of opening his laptop, he found himself standing at the window, watching the reflection of the dining room in the glass. Watching as Abigail gently took Jiwoo's hand and led her upstairs, their silhouettes moving past the windows like ghosts of a warmth he thought he'd never feel again. That night, Minho lay awake in the bed he'd once shared with Sue Jean, staring at the ceiling. He could hear Abigail moving around in the guest room down the hall, no longer in the maid's quarters, because Jiwoo had insisted she stay closer. He heard her singing softly, a lullaby in a language he didn't understand, but that somehow sounded like comfort itself. And for the first time in 18 months, Park Minho allowed himself to wonder what it might feel like to let the ice begin to melt. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening, when Seoul was hit with an unexpected thunderstorm. Minho had been in back-to-back meetings all day, demolishing a competitor's acquisition attempt with the cold precision that had made him legendary in Korean business circles. He felt nothing during the proceedings, not triumph, not satisfaction. Just the hollow efficiency of a machine performing its function. He arrived home drenched despite his driver's attempts with an umbrella, his expensive suit ruined, his mood as dark as the storm clouds overhead. The house was different. Again. There was music playing, not the quiet, funeral home atmosphere he'd maintained for months, but actual music. Some kind of Afrobeat that pulsed with life and rhythm. And light. Every room seemed to glow warm and golden. What the hell? He followed the sound to the living room and stopped dead. Jiwoo was dancing. His daughter, his silent, broken daughter, was moving to the music while Abigail demonstrated some kind of traditional dance, her hips swaying with an unconscious sensuality that made Minho's mouth go dry despite his anger. Both women were laughing. Jiwoo still wasn't speaking, but she was laughing, a sound he thought he'd never hear again. What is going on here? His voice cut through the music like a knife. Abigail spun around, slightly breathless, her eyes bright with joy that dimmed the moment she saw his face. She quickly turned off the music. Mr. Park, we were just... Jiwoo, go to your room. The girl's face fell. She looked between her father and Abigail, then shook her head stubbornly. Now! His voice was arctic. Jiwoo's eyes filled with tears, the first tears he'd seen from her since the funeral, and she ran from the room, her footsteps pounding up the stairs. The silence that followed was deafening. How dare you? Minho said quietly, advancing on Abigail with controlled fury. How dare you come into my home and turn it into some kind of circus? My daughter was perfectly fine before you. Perfectly fine. Abigail's voice rose incredulously. She wasn't speaking. She barely ate. She was disappearing right in front of you, and you were too blind to see it because you were too busy disappearing yourself. You know nothing about what you're talking about. I know that girl is alive for the first time in months. Abigail's eyes blazed with matching anger. I know she smiles now. I know she eats 3 meals a day. I know she started doing her homework again, and her teachers have noticed the change. But you can't see any of that because it means acknowledging that life is still happening, even though your wife is gone. Don't you dare! Minho grabbed her arm, pulling her close, his face inches from hers. Don't you dare speak about my wife. Why not? Abigail didn't pull away, didn't flinch. Her breathing was rapid, her chest rising and falling with emotion. Someone needs to tell you that she wouldn't want this. That she wouldn't want her daughter to grow up in a tomb with a father who's already dead inside. You know nothing about what Sujin would want. Then tell me, Abigail shouted, tears streaming down her face now. Tell me about her. Tell me why you loved her. Tell me anything other than this cold, empty nothing you've turned into. Minho stared at her, his grip on her arm tightening. He could feel her pulse racing under his fingers, could see the tears on her cheeks catching the lamplight, could smell that coconut oil and something else, something warm and alive and so different from the antiseptic emptiness he'd wrapped around himself. She was kind, he whispered, his voice breaking. She was kind and patient, and she saw the best in everyone. She made me better. She made me human. And when she died, she took all of that with her. Abigail's expression softened, her anger melting into compassion. No, Minho. She didn't take it with her. You buried it because it hurt too much to feel anything at all. It was the first time she'd used his given name. The intimacy of it, combined with the understanding in her eyes, shattered something inside him. I can't, he said roughly. I can't let myself feel it, because if I start, I won't be able to stop. I'll fall apart and I can't. Ji-woo needs me to be strong. Ji-woo needs you to be her father, Abigail said gently. Not a stone statue. She needs to see that it's okay to grieve, to be sad, to miss her mother, but also to laugh again, to live again. They stood there, barely a breath apart, and Minho became acutely aware that he was still holding her arm, that his thumb was unconsciously stroking the soft skin of her inner wrist, that she was trembling, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Abigail, he said hoarsely, and her name in his mouth felt like prayer and blasphemy all at once. She looked up at him through wet lashes, her lips slightly parted, and for one insane moment he wanted to close the distance between them. Wanted to taste those lips, to bury his hands in that hair, to lose himself in her warmth and forget. He released her abruptly and stepped back, his breathing uneven. I apologize, he said stiffly. That was inappropriate. You're my employee. Minho. Mr. Park, he corrected sharply. I'm going to my study. Please ensure Ji-woo eats dinner. He walked away, every step requiring monumental effort. Behind him, he heard Abigail's soft sob, and it took everything in him not to turn around. In his study, Minho collapsed into his chair and put his head in his hands. What was wrong with him? Sujin had been gone less than 2 years. He had no right to feel, whatever this was. This pull toward a woman who was everything Sujin wasn't. Loud where his wife had been quiet, bold where she'd been gentle, fire where she'd been calm waters. But God help him, he felt it anyway. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened slightly, and Ji-woo slipped inside, holding a piece of paper. She walked to his desk and placed it in front of him, then looked at him with eyes so much like her mother's that his heart ached. Minho picked up the paper. It was a drawing, crude but clear. 3 stick figures, a tall man, a woman with a colorful dress, and a girl in the middle, holding both their hands. All 3 were smiling. Above the drawing, in Ji-woo's careful handwriting, were 3 words. Please don't break us. Minho's vision blurred with tears he'd been holding back for months. He looked up at his daughter, this brave, beautiful girl who was trying so hard to heal, who was reaching out to him even though he'd been unreachable for so long. Ji-woo, his voice cracked. Baby, I'm so sorry. She rounded the desk and climbed into his lap like she used to do when she was small, before the world went dark. Minho wrapped his arms around her and finally let himself cry. They stayed like that for a long time, father and daughter mourning together for the first time since Sujin's death. And somewhere in the house, Abigail Kelechi packed her bags, convinced that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that her time in this house, and in these people's hearts, was over. She didn't know that Ji-woo had other plans. And she definitely didn't know that Park Minho lay awake all night, his daughter's drawing on his nightstand, thinking about warm brown eyes and a smile that made him remember what hope felt like. The storm outside raged on, but inside the Park mansion, something was shifting. Something dangerous and exhilarating and terrifying. Something that felt remarkably like the beginning of healing. Morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the storm having washed soul clean. Minho woke early, 6 a.m., his usual time, but everything felt different. He could hear movement in the kitchen. Smell coffee. He found Abigail at the counter, her bags packed by the door, making breakfast with the quiet efficiency of someone preparing to say goodbye. You're leaving. It wasn't a question. She turned, and he saw the sleepless night written on her face. I think it's best, Mr. Park. I've overstepped. Multiple times. This position isn't. Stay. Abigail blinked. I'm sorry. Minho moved into the kitchen, maintaining careful distance but holding her gaze. Jiwoo spoke yesterday. After I sent you away. She didn't use words, but she communicated more clearly than she has in months. She showed me what she wants. He paused, struggling with vulnerability. She wants you to stay. And I think she might be right. Mr. Park. Minho. He took a breath. When we're alone, call me Minho. I think we're past formalities, don't you? Something flickered in Abigail's eyes. Surprise, wariness, and something warmer. This is complicated. Yes. I'm your employee. Yes. I'm Nigerian. You're Korean. I don't know your culture, your language properly. Abigail. He stepped closer, drawn by a force he couldn't name. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you already are. Someone who brought light back into a house that had forgotten what it looked like. Someone my daughter trusts. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth, even when it hurts. He paused. Someone you what? She whispered. Minho reached out slowly, giving her time to move away. When she didn't, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Someone I'm starting to realize I don't want to live without. The admission hung between them like a confession. Your wife, Abigail started, would want me to live, Minho said firmly. Would want Jiwoo to laugh. Would want this house to be a home again. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I visited her grave last night, after Jiwoo went to bed, and I talked to her for the first time since the funeral. Really talked. And I think she sent you to us. Abigail's eyes filled with tears. You don't mean that. Don't I? Minho smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. A stubborn Nigerian woman who refuses to accept my walls, who makes my daughter smile, who calls me out on my nonsense. That's exactly the kind of thing Sujin would do. Despite everything, Abigail laughed through her tears. You're crazy. Probably. His expression grew serious. But I'm also done being frozen. Done hiding. Done pretending that just surviving is enough. He cupped her face with both hands now. I'm terrified, Abigail. I don't know how to do this. But I know that when you're in the room, I remember what it feels like to want to try. Minho. His name was a prayer on her lips. The kitchen door burst open, and Jiwoo ran in, still in her pajamas, her eyes wide with panic when she saw Abigail's packed bags. She ran to Abigail, wrapping her arms around the woman's waist, shaking her head frantically. It's okay, Abigail soothed, stroking the girl's hair. It's okay, sweetness. I'm staying. I'm not going anywhere. 1 year later. The wedding was beautiful, a blend of cultures that somehow made perfect sense. Abigail wore both a traditional white hanbok and a Nigerian iro and buba, changing between them throughout the day. Minho's mother had cried, first from resistance, then from genuine joy when she saw how her son smiled again. But the real ceremony happened earlier in private. Minho, Abigail, and Jiwoo visited Sujin's grave together. Abigail placed flowers, white chrysanthemums, Sujin's favorite, and spoke softly. Thank you, she said simply, for trusting me with them, for this family you built. I promise to honor your memory, to tell Jiwoo stories about you, to make sure she knows how deeply she was loved. She paused. And thank you for teaching him how to love. It made it easier for him to love again. Jiwoo, who had started speaking again 6 months ago, added her own prayer. Then she looked at her father. She's happy, Appa. I can feel it. Minho knelt between his daughter and his soon-to-be wife, one hand on Sujin's headstone. I will always love you, he said quietly. You gave me Jiwoo. You taught me what it meant to be human. But you also taught me that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies. He looked at Abigail. So thank you for that final gift. For showing me it was okay to live again. As they walked away, Minho in the middle, holding both their hands, Abigail glanced back once. She could have sworn she saw a woman's silhouette near the grave, smiling with approval. But when she blinked, there was only sunshine and the promise of new beginnings. The park mansion was no longer a tomb. It was filled with music and laughter, with jollof rice and kimchi sharing the dinner table, with a daughter who spoke 3 languages and a father who'd remembered how to smile. And sometimes, late at night when Minho held Abigail close, he whispered his gratitude, not just to her, but to the woman who'd loved him first. The woman who'd loved him enough to send him someone who could teach him that frozen hearts could thaw. That life, with all its mess and pain and unexpected beauty, was always worth living. And that love in all its forms was the thing that made us human.